BBC News. Now, in a change to our published schedule, Jeremy Thorpe, The Silent Conspiracy, in which Tom Mangold explores the strange circumstances surrounding some aspects of Mr. Thorpe's life, with the aid both of new evidence and of material from the 1970s, which has never previously been broadcast.
I just got so frightened I ran out onto the moors. So I turned back, thinking Lincoln may be coming round, and ran back, and he levelled the gun at me again. It still must have been jammed, and he just gave up, and he said, "I'll get you," and jumped in the car and turned round and drove off. Then this car came along. I ran out and tried to stop them, and of course I was covered in blood. I said, "My dog's been shot," but it was so garbled, they thought I'd been shot. And then, I mean, in all my nerves and worry, I said, it's all because of Jeremy Thorpe. You see, even then, you know, my shock, I realised it. I said, it's because of Jeremy Thorpe.
The voice of Norman Scott, speaking in the 1970s and describing the moment he said a would-be assassin tried to kill him. An assassin he claimed had been hired by Jeremy Thorpe, who then was the leader of the Liberal Party. Thorpe was charged with incitement and conspiracy to murder, and in 1979 was cleared at the Old Bailey.
I have always maintained that I was innocent of the charges brought against me, and the verdict of the jury, after a prolonged and careful investigation by them, I regard as totally fair, just, and a complete vindication.
But there was another conspiracy of a quite different dimension, one that never reached the court. It wasn't based on explicit agreement by powerful establishment figures in smoke-filled rooms, but founded on quiet understandings and implicit assumptions inherent in British society 40 years ago. I investigated this story for the BBC at the time for a documentary that wasn't transmitted for legal reasons. The material I and my colleagues obtained provides a unique and remarkable snapshot of attitudes in Britain in the late 60s and 70s, and we now broadcast the material for the first time. The whole story springs from Jeremy Thorpe's homosexuality. Today, the existence of gay pride and the relaxed consensus about private sexuality would rarely be a problem for an honest and open politician. But back in the 60s, the public climate was totally different. Indeed, homosexual acts, even between consenting adults, remained a criminal offence until 1967, and one that carried severe penalties and moral opprobrium. The first hint of trouble was an indiscretion by Thorpe with a rent boy in the United States, which was reported to the FBI. They tipped off Britain's MI5, and a file on Thorpe was created. It came to the attention of his local police force in Devon.
I was one who insisted on pursuing all homosexual complaints.
Sir Ranulph Bacon was Chief Constable of Devon when Thorpe was first elected MP for North Devon in 1959. He spoke to me in 1979.
There was an inquiry from London as to whether there was any knowledge in Devon, where Mr. Thorpe was a member of Parliament, as to whether there was any homosexual association known with which he could be connected.
And you were asked to conduct an inquiry into this?
I suppose you could call it that. Yes, it was a very discreet inquiry. It wasn't one that many people knew about.
Could I hazard a guess that it was an inquiry done on behalf of the security services? Would that be a reasonable assumption?
Yes, I think so.
What kind of conclusion was reached?
Nothing more than suspicion. And this arose through known associates and so on. Nothing more than suspicion.
Was then Jeremy Thorpe's homosexuality reasonably well known in the area?
I wouldn't have thought it was well known, but I think a lot of people suspected it.
Peter Bessell, who himself later became a Liberal MP, was a close friend of Jeremy Thorpe.
I was concerned that this could damage his chances because people were saying, why doesn't Jeremy get engaged? Why isn't Jeremy out with girls? This was the sort of question mark over him.
In 1960, Thorpe met a stable boy from a humble background who was working for one of his friends, Norman Scott, a naive, shy but self-centered and dependent young man, was to become Thorpe's lover and his nemesis. This is how in 1979 Scott recalled the first moments of their relationship.
He seemed full of sort of earnest endeavour, sort of great warmth and kindness, which I hadn't ever really experienced. This man seemed to be offering to be there, to be caring. And I broke down with this sort of the warmth of it, the beauty of it in a way. And I began to cry, and he said, "You mustn't cry." Well, I didn't stop crying. He put his arms around me, and well, the next thing was he was in bed with me. I wasn't surprised because I just didn't have any thoughts about that. I mean, I was very disgusted with the fact that, with what I was doing. I just didn't really want to think about it. I suppose I was incredibly, in a way, very lucky that I wasn't charged, and certainly he was, but I didn't really give it a great deal of thought.
An affair developed from there, and in February 1962, Thorpe wrote a notorious letter to Scott, later known as the Bummy's Letter, an unambiguous and affectionate note from one man to another and unequivocal confirmation of their gay relationship. But the relationship did not endure. As the affair cooled, Scott suddenly hinted he might not go quietly. Thorpe, he claims, responded by saying something both prescient and menacing.
He said that a great friend of his was the Director of Public Prosecutions, and I couldn't harm him in any way.
Alone and near despair, the unworldly Scott moved to London, and as far as Thorpe was concerned, now became a loose cannon. Scott threatened suicide, had numerous breakdowns, and began hinting darkly at a criminal sexual relationship with someone very high up. A friend of Scott's called the local police. Robert Huntley was one of the detectives who saw Scott. Then a detective inspector at Chelsea Police Station, he listened to Scott's strange story, and what he was telling the police was dynamite for Thorpe. It was an explicit account of their sexual relationship. If true, both men were guilty of what was then a serious criminal offence. Yet the only man who could have settled the allegation one way or the other wasn't interviewed. In fact, there was no discernible investigation at all. In 1979, I asked Huntley about this.
I do remember we made a decision that there was no need to interview Thorpe, because we knew what the answer would be at the conclusion of our inquiry. It would be a denial. And
how did you know he would deny it if you didn't see him?
Because of the individual, who he is. I mean, even today, at this present time, he is still strenuously denying there was a homosexual relationship.
How did you know at that time that he would deny it?
Well, that was an assessment. I mean,
how could you assess him if you hadn't seen him?
Well, can you imagine a person in his position coming forward and admitting to a police officer?
How do you know that he wouldn't admit it?
Well, that was my assessment of the man.
Huntley's mindset was redolent of class attitudes in the 70s.
Do you think that a man of that caliber is going to admit that type of conduct? I don't think so.
Precisely. It was the deference of a policeman towards a man of that caliber, a middle-class and respected member of Parliament facing the allegations of a neurotic working-class stable boy. Even more significantly, the MI5 file showing Thorpe was indeed a homosexual was neither sought by the Chelsea detective nor offered to him by MI5 or Special Branch, the police section dealing with political matters.
When you carried out your investigation, did you know or were you ever told that a security investigation had been carried out on Jeremy Thorpe by the Chief Constable of Devon?
Not to my knowledge, no. Certainly if it had been carried out, I would have dearly loved to find out what the result of that investigation was.
You were never told?
Never told, and that is news to me today.
It was carried out by Sir Ranulph Bacon.
Well, that's the first time I've heard of that.
But the more shrewd Sir Ranulph Bacon knew what was really going on. Do you think Devon should have sent that report to London?
I would have thought so, yes.
Why do you think it didn't?
Unless somebody wanted to cover something up, I can't really give you an answer to that.
The dramatic MI5 Special Branch file on Jeremy Thorpe remained seemingly inaccessible to those who really needed it. I believe the file was suddenly lifted out of Scotland Yard's registry and tucked very securely away where virtually no one, even on legitimate police business, could lay hands on it. This was an issue I also raised in 1979 with Sir Ranulph Bacon, who had himself moved in the 1960s from Devon to become Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard.
Now, the conclusion reached by Robert Huntley, who investigated these allegations, was that they couldn't be proven. Nevertheless, the file seems to have been referred upwards and upwards at Scotland Yard. Why do you think that would have been the case?
Oh, because it concerned a Member of Parliament.
Now, we know that eventually the file finished up in the safe of the Assistant Commissioner of Crime. What about that safe? What did it look like? A sinister safe, a huge safe, or what?
It was a whacking great old-fashioned iron and steel safe that stood up on a very substantial wooden stand, and it contained nothing but files, not very many files, but those that it was thought were proper to be held personally by the Assistant Commissioner.
And what kind of files are we talking about? Files on whom?
Well, the kind of file that we're talking about now. Things that were going to create a public scandal, or might create a public scandal, touchy, confidential information.
Can you tell me why a file should go into that safe in the first place?
I think in cases where it was important to prevent the file from being open to inspection by all and sundry within the department. There were cases about which the fewer people who knew, the better.
Some people might regard that as a rather privileged system, that some people's files are allowed to go into the ACC safe while other people's files have to hang around in registry.
Oh, I think that's one of the things that the ACC has to use its discretion over.
A touch of privilege, a dash of discretion, a time-tested establishment treatment for gentlemen of standing applied by those who knew instinctively what to do to help someone in difficulty. So Jeremy Thorpe remained untroubled. Sir Ranulph Bacon again.
The fact that somebody is a Member of Parliament doesn't preclude him from prosecution. The fact that he is a Member of Parliament would, however, possibly affect the treatment of the case, in that it would have to be brought to the notice of, shall I say, more senior officers than would happen in the case of a normal run-of-the-mill allegation of homosexuality. This would have reached the Commissioner, no doubt, because it would be important for him to warn the Home Secretary that a Member of Parliament was being accused, and the Minister concerned had every right to know that such an allegation had been made.
So, special treatment for Jeremy Thorpe, buttressed during those years by another important factor. In the early 1960s, Britain was being rocked by a series of sex and spy scandals. There was the Bessell affair, a national scandal involving a homosexual Admiralty clerk in Moscow hopelessly and sexually compromised by the KGB into revealing the nation's secrets.
Full confession the prosecution claimed Bessell made. It showed that the trouble started when he was in the Naval Attaché's office of the British Embassy in Moscow in 1955. One night he was taken out to dinner by some Russian officials, plied with brandy and photographed in compromising sexual acts. The Russians threatened to make an international incident of it, and soon he was producing secret documents for them.
Next came the Christine Keeler scandal, in which Jack Profumo, then Minister for War, had an affair with Keeler even while she was having a concurrent affair with a Russian spy who wanted her to extract pillow talk secrets about nuclear weapons from the minister. A little earlier there was the Kim Philby affair, the third man in the notorious case of Burgess and McLean. All three spies, one of them an overt homosexual, had fled to the Soviet Union, proving Britain's MI6 had been deeply penetrated by the Soviets. The last thing Britain needed now was yet another homosexual scandal involving a leading and fast-rising Member of Parliament. Support for this theory comes from a conversation between Thorpe's friend Peter Bessell and Sir Frank Soskis, who became the Labour Home Secretary in 1964. Bessell Bessell, by now an MP, told me in 1979 that he'd asked Soskis why the police had ignored Scott's formal criminal complaint against Thorpe.
He said that decision was taken not to investigate the matter further. And I said, because the evidence wasn't strong enough, presumably. And he hesitated. And he said, well, the evidence might have contributed to that decision, but he said there were a lot of other factors at that time. And he reminded me of the case of John Bessell, the Admiralty clerk who was prosecuted for passing secrets to the Russians, and his defense in court was that he'd been forced to do so by the KGB because they'd blackmailed him, in effect, because he was a homosexual. And it would not have done at that moment in time to have shown that there was a similar risk in that members of Parliament were open to the same kind of blackmail. And he said that is the kind of consideration that would be taken into account in making a decision not to introduce a prosecution.
In other words, there was a cover-up.
Yes, I think that's right. I don't think it can be described as anything else.
Thorpe's main MI5 file may have been safely hidden in the famous Scotland Yard iron and steel safe, but there had been a hemorrhage of some documents on Thorpe's sexual proclivities to Barnstable Police Headquarters in Devon. Tim Kegwin, Thorpe's Conservative political opponent in North Devon, told me in 1979 how he heard about a file while campaigning for the seat.
We went to the police station in Barnstable. They were very overcrowded, and they wanted me to see just how bad they were overcrowded. But when I arrived there, a senior policeman, out of doors, took me on one side, wished me luck, and said, and this was quite a shock to me, and he said, I wish you all the best, and if you could only use what we know, we've got a file that fat. And this, quite honestly, rather shook me. I hadn't, known that there was anything that specific about it at all.
And what was in the file?
I didn't, of course, see the file, but he indicated pretty clearly. I think I asked him something of that kind, obviously as a follow-up, and he said, coming and staying in hotels with young men and that sort of thing in and around this district.
When Thorpe learned, as he did, of the existence of this file in Barnstable, he knew only too well that it was fused and likely to explode all over his career. He needed a bomb disposal man. So typically, and with considerable nerve, Thorpe asked Bessell to deal with the problem. Perhaps he could have a little word, one MP to another, quite informal, of course, with Sir Frank Soskis, the Home Secretary. Bessell complied.
I moved on to the question of the file and said that it was possible, at least in Jeremy's view, that the Barnstable police might contact the Metropolitan Police and that they would discover the existence of a file resulting from a statement that Norman Scott had made 2 years earlier and letters that Scott had handed over to the police. And Frank Soskis' attitude initially was that he didn't think that was anything to worry about, that it was unlikely the inquiry would be extended.
With the Home Office on side, and for all the best reasons, Jeremy Thorpe's career now began to take off. He was charismatic, clever, charming, and showed just the right leadership qualities. In January 1967, after only 8 years in Parliament, he became leader of the Liberal Party. He developed a cross-party rapport with the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson. He also became a Privy Councillor, meaning he would now have privileged access to some of the nation's most secret secrets. This appointment was natural for a party leader, but the fact remains that access to secret intelligence was wholly contrary to the spirit, letter and intention of a hugely important security report. This had been drawn up by Lord Denning 4 years earlier, following the profound repercussions of the Bessell, Philby and Profumo spy scandals. In defining anyone who should be regarded as a security risk, and therefore denied access to intelligence reports, Denning wrote, "I would normally regard homosexual behavior as creating a security risk, at any rate if it was a recent date. The existence of photographs heightens the security risk, so also do compromising letters. They would be a most potent weapon in the hands of a blackmailer even after several years." Nevertheless, Thorpe remained untroubled by his peers. A few months before becoming leader, he had travelled on a special fact-finding mission to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where the then white minority government had sparked an international crisis by unilaterally declaring independence from Britain. On his return from this highly sensitive assignment, he'd been personally debriefed by the Prime Minister Harold Walsham. He also saw the Commonwealth Secretary Arthur Bottomley, the minister most involved with the Rhodesian dispute, who spoke to me in 1979.
I think the value of the trip that he made on the whole was useful.
Was the Commonwealth Office informed by the security services of the existence of a file that indicated he might be a security risk?
Now, I can't answer for the office, but certainly as Secretary of State, I was not informed.
And do you believe that if such a file existed, you should have been informed?
Yes, certainly. I should have been told about that.
Are you saying that you're now hearing in this interview for the first time that this file existed?
Yes.
The political and social rise of Thorpe continued without hindrance. In May 1968 he married, and as if to emphasize Thorpe's position in establishment circles, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself officiated. Norman Scott, however, was going nowhere. Yet his nuisance potential never quite blacked out. A warning light flickered when Scott discovered he was out of benefit because his old lover Thorpe appeared to have lost his national insurance card. But good old reliable Peter Bessell once more came to the rescue, quietly interceding personally on Thorpe's behalf with another government minister, this time David Ennells, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Security. Shortly afterwards, the ministry obligingly wrote to Scott, reminding him that although he was personally liable for the £290 worth of unpaid contributions, in the particular circumstances of your case, no action will be taken to press you to pay these contributions. And what were those particular circumstances? How about the kind intervention by the minister himself on behalf of a fellow MP? But still Scott wouldn't go away. Now as discreet as a town crier, he moved in with a widow, Gwen Parry-Jones, and tearfully told her the whole story about himself and his old lover. She promptly contacted another Liberal MP, Emlyn Hewson, who invited her and Scott to come to London. They met the Liberal Party's chief whip, David Steele, as Norman Scott recalled in 1979.
David Steele was very brisk and said that the whole thing was lies and it couldn't possibly be true. And so I felt that I must show him what I'd taken down with me in this file of the letters, the Bessell letters, which proved that there had been something done to contain me. And David Steele completely changed when he read this file and said, this is absolutely dreadful. And his words were, he'll have to go.
In his own memoirs, David Steele doesn't confirm that he said Thorpe had to go. He does record that at first he found Scott's account implausible, but then admits to being alarmed when he saw the letters. The Bessell letters were highly indiscreet notes from Bessell accompanying regular payments he'd been making to Scott. A secret internal Liberal Party inquiry began. Thorpe was obliged to lean even more heavily on the power of privilege and political access to the establishment, his establishment after all. At the subsequent conspiracy to murder trial, prosecuting counsel alleged that Thorpe manipulated both the Home Secretary Reginald Maudling and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Sir John Waldron. His status gave him personal access to both men and allowed him to plead his case privately, one-on-one. Eventually Maudling and Waldron met to discuss Thorpe's position. The Home Secretary was shown the Bunny's letter. He read it, held it, and mused that he now had Thorpe's career in his hands. Far from wrecking it, he decided to help him out. Maudling wrote to Thorpe saying that he and Waldron saw no reason to disagree with a wholly dishonest account that Thorpe had composed about his relationship with Scott. Thorpe passed this on to the secret Liberal inquiry into his behaviour, which promptly collapsed. He was vindicated, his political enemies were routed, and Scott's last hope of a fair deal disappeared. Thorpe remained Liberal leader. In 1973, in a moment of superb hypocrisy, he passed comment on a notorious call girl scandal involving the Tory Defence Minister, Lord Lambton.
I think one starts from the premise that if you are in public life,
you are therefore, by definition, far more vulnerable. You must therefore not put yourself in a position where you can be subject to blackmail or other pressures. And this therefore accounts for a whole lot of peccadilloes, which might be peccadilloes for a private citizen, but become a great danger to security when by a person in public life.
The February 1974 general election ended the Conservatives' overall majority in Parliament. Ted Heath's only hope of remaining Prime Minister was to do a deal with the Liberals. Thorpe had had a huge personal victory in his constituency and now effectively held the balance of power. Heath promptly invited him to Number 10 to discuss terms for a parliamentary coalition.
There have been more meetings in Whitehall and Westminster this morning over the future of the government, following Mr. Heath's decision to stay in office for the time being. The man at the centre of all the weekend's comings and goings, Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, has been having a crucial session at the House of Commons this morning with the 13 other Liberal MPs in the new Parliament.
A deal would undoubtedly have led to Thorpe taking a cabinet post in a coalition government. According to Bessell, Thorpe was offered either the Home Office or the Foreign Office. So despite being wide open to blackmail, Thorpe, as Home Secretary, would have been in charge of his own security file at MI5, and he would have known all about our counterintelligence work against the Soviet Union. Or as Foreign Secretary, he would have been the Minister for MI6, with knowledge of our spying operations overseas. Tim Kegwin, Thorpe's vanquished Tory opponent in North Devon, grasped the seriousness of the situation and made urgent contact with the Conservative Central Office.
We felt in North Devon we hadn't got the resources, and it would be wrong for us to investigate it ourselves. And therefore we passed it up the line to them, and they did undertake to look into this, because clearly there were possible security implications. The point is that if this deal had gone through a few days after that election, and if there'd been, say, 2 cabinet posts allocated to Liberals, and if Mr. Thorpe, as would certainly have been the case, had had one of them, he might have been Minister of Defence, he might have been Foreign Secretary, he might have been Home Secretary, who knows. And in such a position, I think it would have been a very insecure position, and so I was angry, yes, that more was not done to investigate it fully. If the Tory leadership at that time really did not know what had been going on, well, they hadn't done much investigation into it.
The truth is that everyone who needed to know did know about the secret homosexuality that left Thorpe so vulnerable to blackmail. The police knew and had their files. So did Special Branch, so did the security services. The Home Office knew and had its file, and the Prime Minister himself, Ted Heath, should certainly have been told. But as it happens, the Tory-Liberal deal was opposed by the other Liberal MPs and never materialised. However, by 1975, the word about the old affair was well and truly out, and Norman Scott suddenly became a moving target. On the evening of October the 24th, 1975, a former pilot called Andrew Newton drove with Norman Scott and his pet dog Rinker, a Great Dane, onto Exmoor, and there he shot Rinker dead. When he then turned the gun towards Scott, it appeared to jam. Scott felt that he was lucky to escape with his life. Newton's account later was that he only intended to frighten Scott, not to kill him. Newton went to prison for shooting the dog and for possession of the gun, but there was clearly much more to the incident.
Although they appear nowhere in the indictment, the names of Jeremy Thorpe and his wife Marion were repeatedly mentioned during the case, mainly by the principal prosecution witness, Norman Scott. Scott alleged that the shooting of his dog was linked with an unpublished book about his relationship with Mr. Thorpe, a book written in collaboration.
The gun had been provided to Newton by a friend of his, then a minor South London criminal called Dennis Meehan. He's now recorded an interview for the first time. He says that initially he was asked to kill Scott by a man who, according to Newton, represented a senior figure in the Liberal Party. At a meeting in Shepherd's Bush in West London, Meehan says the conversation turned to Norman Scott and the delicate subject of murder.
Well, at first I was very cagey about it, with the words they used, but he was being a white nuisance and he was blackmailing somebody important and would be well looked after if we sorted him out, got rid of the problem. And it built up very vaguely and gradually built up to, would I go down there would I be interested in doing the job?
Getting rid of Norman Scott.
Getting rid of Norman Scott, yeah.
Following this meeting, Meehan drove from London to Barnstable in Devon, where Scott was living in a pub.
I went with a friend who was useful on this affair drive, and you never know what's going to happen.
When you drove down to Barnstable that day, was it your intention to kill Norman Scott?
Well, I didn't mind to do it, but the conditions would have had to be right. You know, it's a big step shooting somebody. And
let me just ask you again, because it just needs a yes or no. Was it your intention at that time to kill Norman Scott?
Yes.
But Meehan then pulled out of this contract because he thought as a stranger with a pronounced London accent, he would be too conspicuous in small-town Barnstable. He says he then passed the intended murder weapon on to Newton. He also states he later confessed all this in a detailed statement he gave to Scotland Yard. Then, out of the blue, he got a mysterious phone call, apparently from a police officer, telling him to go to a police station.
He said, well, go to the station, tell me your name, and you'll be handed an envelope. Have a look at it. He said, if you like the statement, sign it and give it back to the police, to the wooden tops, say nothing to them.
When Meehan carried out these instructions, it was as if he'd walked into a prepared script.
I just walked up to the counter, told them my name, and they all turned around and looked at me, wondered what's going on, I think. And they gave me the envelope and told me to go into one of the interrogation rooms. And I just went in there on my own, read the statement, which did me no end of favours. But it did Jeremy Thorpe no end of favours as well, because it left him completely out of it. So I thought, well, I've got to sign this. So I signed it, give it back to them, said nothing to them, and that was the end of it.
Somebody had prepared a statement for you to sign in your own name as if you had made the statement.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
So, can you remember why it got you off the hook?
Well, I just virtually left everything out that was incriminating. But like I say, at the same time, everything I said about the Liberal Party, Jeremy Thorpe, etc., was left out as well.
Everything you'd written about the Liberal Party and Jeremy Thorpe, you'd written in your original police statement.
Yeah.
So suddenly a second statement is produced. It's got nothing to do with you, but it excludes everything you said about Jeremy Thorpe and the Liberal Party, and it takes you off the hook.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's why I signed it.
So the effect was you would never appear in court.
That's right.
And if Meehan never appeared in court, not only could he not be charged with, at the very least, the firearms offences he'd admitted, but, much more importantly, he could never reveal on oath what he had already told Scotland Yard of an apparent plot organised by a Liberal Party person to murder Norman Scott, an outcome that would hugely favour Jeremy Thorpe. But ironically, this manoeuvre came just a little too late to help Thorpe, because by now the national media were in a feeding frenzy about possible connections between the Liberal Party, its leader, a stable boy called Norman Scott, and a contract to kill him. The toothpaste was effectively out of the tube, and for all the protection that had been afforded him, Thorpe's position had now become intolerable. On November the 20th, 1978, Jeremy Thorpe, his best friend David Holmes, and two others stood to attention in the small dock at Minehead Magistrates Court, where each was charged that they had conspired with others to murder Norman Scott. They were committed for trial at the Old Bailey. The main prosecution witness was the man who'd once been Thorpe's friend, Peter Bessell.
Because Mr. Thorpe was worried the police were investigating his relationship with Mr. Scott. Mr. Bessell told the court about meetings he'd had in Mr. Thorpe's room at the House of Commons, at which a plan to murder Norman Scott was broached by Mr. Thorpe and discussed in detail. Mr. Thorpe, sitting in the dock, gazed intently at Mr. Bessell during his 3 hours in the witness box.
Thorpe chose not to give evidence in his own defence. This was his legal right, but it avoided any potentially embarrassing cross-examination. And he must have been delighted by the final summing up at the Old Bailey from Justice Cantley. The judge did not seem impressed by the prosecution witnesses. He told the jury that Norman Scott was a crook, a fraud, a sponger, a whiner, and a parasite, that Peter Bessell was a humbug, and that Andrew Newton was a chump. While on the other hand, he reminded the jury that Jeremy Thorpe was a national figure with a very distinguished public record. Surprised that the judge's somewhat subjective remarks even extended to some of the defence lawyers, as has been previously made clear by Gereth Williams QC, who acted for one of the other defendants.
I don't think the witnesses were objectively treated. I don't think the prosecution case was fairly assessed by the judge. I think that there was too much kowtowing to Mr. Thorpe's social and political position.
On Friday, June the 22nd, 1979, all 4 defendants were found not guilty of all the charges. Thorpe was a free man once more. But public opinion passed its own judgment, and his political career ended, and he was never to recover from the whole episode. Out of the intense personal tragedy for one of Britain's more likeable, colourful and potentially powerful politicians emerged more prosaic matters. In the 1960s and 70s, British society was much less tolerant of homosexuals such as Jeremy Thorpe than it is today, but it also remained a class-bound nation. Establishment groups did not need to conspire in discreet pall-mall clubrooms to maintain what they perceived to be the trust and respect of those they ruled. The jury found there was no conspiracy to murder Norman Scott. However, there could never be a trial to establish whether or not there had been a conspiracy to protect an all-important member of the establishment, like Jeremy Thorpe, from the consequences of his own behaviour. The truth is, no plot was needed because it happened on its own anyway. It was a conspiracy without conspirators, a silent conspiracy based on assumption, custom and instinct. That was how things used to work.
Jeremy Thorpe, The Silent Conspiracy, was presented by Tom Mangold and produced